Alright. Welcome back. This is part 4 of the, I mean, you can see the title of the fucking video, right? Part 4 of the adventure platforming tutorial thingy I've been doing. Today, we're not going to talk about progressions at all, hopefully, probably. Instead, we're going to focus... So we've been talking about the structure of the levels a lot, but we haven't... I dropped the gamepad. We haven't been talking much about, like, what goes into the content of the gameplay, which is obviously worth discussing. And I kind of copped out of it by saying it's like traditional Mario. And that's true, but actually it's in a way it's not like traditional Mario. It's not. In one very key, one very important way. The player, you have to assume that the player is lost. And they are walking back and forth trying to find the next place to go. And what that means, like, it's easy to take it for granted, but what it really means is that if you place an enemy, let's say you place a Goomba, right, on a platform. Normally, in traditional Mario, they're going to run past the Goomba, or they're going to kill the Goomba or whatever. They're going to evade or deal with the Goomba, and then it's gone forever, right? You placed exactly one Goomba, and it was a non-issue. In this case, you place a Goomba, let's say you place a Goomba at like a key juncture in the level, that in an ideal run, the player would have to go through at least 4 times. You've just placed 4 Goombas. Okay? Because they have to deal with it 4 different times. Except it's actually worse than that. Because they don't know, you have to assume they're going to be making suboptimal routing decisions. Because they don't know exactly where to go if they're playing it blind. As a rule of thumb, I'd just double everything. So you look at how many times a player has to deal with a thing. In this case, our Goomba, they have to deal with it 4 times. And you double it, roughly. So it's like, if you place 1 Goomba, assume that you just placed 8 Goombas. Okay? If you place a Piranha Plant, assume that you just placed like 10 Piranha Plants. If it's in an area that's going to be passed through significantly. Obviously, if it's a place they go to exactly like 1 time, then it is what it is. The enemies you place are the number you see on the screen. But for the most part, you want far fewer threats in these levels, because each individual threat is probably going to be seen far more times. So it's going to amplify. My cat's doing shit. It's going to amplify the difficulty more than you would think so, like in a normal traditional level with these enemies. So they should look fairly sparse unless you're going for something more difficult. Obviously, a lot of this... Did I just hit play? Why did I do that? We're going to look at a couple example courses. 2 good examples from my own work. 1 good example from somebody else. And then 1 bad example I did of what not to do. Probably. What you probably don't want to do. None of this is rules, right? It's just suggestions. So here we have Tomb of the Frost Elemental. And it's kind of a sprawling area, but you can actually kind of tell just from looking around for how expansive it is. There's actually not very many enemies, right? There's not a lot going on the screen. And that's because of what I just talked about. Like, these 2 dry bones right here aren't actually 2 dry bones. These 2 dry bones are many dry bones. Many dry... There's like 10 to 12 dry bones right here. It just doesn't look like it. But that's how many it is in relation to how many opportunities they have to kill the player and force them to backtrack. Which is another thing. These levels are often quite long. So player death is more costly. So in addition to each enemy... like these guys are going to encounter probably several times. In addition to them being multiplied by like a factor of 3 or 4, when they do kill the player, it hurts a lot more. So that's something to keep in mind. So there's not that many enemies placed in the environment. There's a lot of empty space. Another thing we want to pay attention to is platforming elements. It's okay to have tougher platforming. Here we actually have a pretty tricky jump when you come down where you want to... Wow, I actually fucked that up. You come down, you bop the thing, and you do a little wall jump, right? It's actually not that hard once you know what you're doing, but it's somewhat tricky. Okay, it's somewhat tricky, and that's to get up here. You might have to go in that room multiple times. There's a shell in there that you need. This isn't what you need it for, but you can use the shell here once you've already done the trick down here one time to open this passage up. And so now every time you want to go to this door, you can just go this way instead of doing the jump. So that they're not repeating the platforming. And one, it's kind of tedious to redo a trick that you've already done several times. And two, every time you do it, if you end up dying, it adds on to the playtime kind of artificially. And that's not fun. So, just little things like that to look out for. All of the tighter sections in this are like that. Like this, you only have to do one time. This progression, you only have to do one time. Back where I just was, there's a propeller hat section way later in the level that you go through exactly one time. So very, very few enemies. This guy is like a tougher enemy, right? But when you kill him, so like there's a part where you backtrack from over here to here and then back. If you kill him on the way there, then you only have to deal with him once. Whereas these guys, they're lesser enemies, but you have to deal with them there and back. So that's a simple illustration of the concept, right? You want it looks kind of empty, but the emptiness is good. The emptiness is actually very good. Here we go. Is this it? Yeah, Super Metroidvania Brothers. This is another good example of the same kind of concept. Here we have a recurring I guess enemy type of Goombas on tracks going around platforms. Very reminiscent of Super Metroid style enemies. And these guys are they're not difficult to deal with, right? They're just Goombas. But you pass through this section so many times that they're not just Goombas. You know, these 4 Goombas are like 12 Goombas, probably. Right? They're amplified. Over here it gets a little bit more a little bit trickier. Just a little bit trickier. Doing these paths to work through here. To get the fire flower, to get the bomb to go down here. But for the most part, very nicely, not sparse, but like strategic use of enemies. Same here. This part's very, very interesting because, like, you see the intensity has gone up. There's more enemies, there's more cannons, there's spikes, lots of projectiles of different types happening. The difficulty has gone up considerably, but you never have to repeat this section, which is where it's okay, right? It's okay to increase the threat level by several magnitudes compared to, you know, some of the previous rooms, because you only have to go through it once, and once you work through it, you kick the shell through it, and it opens all that, and that whole area basically blinks out of existence. You're done with it. It's like in traditional Mario. You work through a section and it's gone. There it's gone. And as well as we work towards the end of the level, The platforming gets much more intense. The enemies have similar intensity to what was above. It shows a very good attention to difficulty scaling, which is another thing to consider, right? Because the levels are longer, they're a bit more epic, you could say. Scaling really stands out. If you have an easier beginning and a much more difficult ending, relatively speaking, it'll create a more memorable play experience. I think it'll stand out, and they did a very, very good job of it here, where the entire level steadily ratchets up in difficulty, but it does it in sections that aren't repeated as well. Everything that you do multiple times, even towards the end, it's just the simple Goombas and such. Like towards the end, you go over here and like it's the same. These two dudes from the very beginning of the level, right? You're left dealing with them one more time. They get one last chance to try to snipe you and steal a life. So that's a very nice, clean example, as well, of one way to do difficulty. I'm just going to run through a couple of these. It's a simple concept, but just we're going to look at day 10 again. Just to really look at the types of threats as well. So we were looking at dry bones. They're basically like Goombas that respawn quickly. Then we had Goombas on tracks. Here we have piranha plants. I like piranha plants as enemies. These are nice nice stationary things. So they're very tightly controlled, like from a design standpoint, where the encounters happen and how difficult they are. And like here you see, like this is super sparse right here. Look how sparse that is. But the player potentially, if they like a poorly optimized route, they're potentially going to deal with these three dudes like 4 times. So that's actually 12 piranha plants right there. 4 of them shoot fire. That's terrifying. Very sparse, very sparse, very sparse. The outside areas in this entire level have like almost no enemies. There's this chain chomp. It's kind of annoying. Chain chomp, kind of annoying. But for the most part, the outdoors have like nothing. There's nothing going on. By design, because the overworld is supposed to have a lot of wandering and backtracking and confusion, and so it's very lenient in how it handles the player. And then we go underground, and all that shit changes. We have higher enemy density. We have trickier platforming. Like some of these vine jumps are frustrating for some people. As well, back outside, the vine jumps right after the second checkpoint. You don't have to do them multiple times. You do them once and you get the spiked helmet and moved on. They're somewhat tight, and that's not the kind of thing you'd want to have to traverse multiple times. Like rooms like this, like you increase the platforming difficulty slightly. Like it's not very difficult platforming, but still. You increase the danger, more awkwardly placed enemies, way more enemies in general. Like look at this cave. This is one of the first dungeons. Significantly increase the enemy counts, the platforming risk, and that sort of thing. Relative to the outside, because each of these dungeons you have to come in and do it one time, and then you're done. And it also creates a sense of like underground is dangerous, above ground less dangerous in the player, which is kind of thematic as well. So those are good examples, I would argue. Those are good examples of the kind of thing you do want to do. I'm actually kind of thinking, spur of the moment, this is real briefly, we'll just look at it. If you wanted almost no enemies, and this is a platforming focused level, it's actually a little bit more difficult than some of the others, but there's very few enemies. It's really just all platforming. You can also go that direction with your challenges, right? In some of the tighter jumps, like this section right here, has some very, very tight platforming, but you only have to go through this one time. Whereas some of the easier stuff, like down here, you do traverse multiple times. But you can do just really open, just like platforming, somewhat precise platforming levels as Metroidvania as well. There's really, I mean, the engine behind the genre is the power progression, right? But there's a lot you can do with that in terms of the actual gameplay. That level's really just jumping around saws and spikes for a solid, 15-20 minutes. What was the actual one I wanted? This is the one I actually wanted to look at. So this is a bad example. I would say this is what you don't want to do. Probably. Unless you're going for a more difficult level, which you could be going for a more difficult level. But this one begins begins like this. Yeah. So this kind of sets the tone for the whole level. It's trying to jump on the sideways spring to get up here. You can see once you get into this place, basically everywhere you go is dangerous. Everywhere you go is dangerous. This level actively punishes the player for exploring. It punishes the player for looking around. It confuses the player in the process. Very much so, because they not only do they not know which direction to go in, but they have a hard time figuring it out because they're dying so fucking much. This is just a mean level. I kind of love it. But it's a mean fucking level. And there's just nastiness everywhere. There's just spikes and nastiness and timing obstacles and just badness. Just badness. Just a bunch of bad shit. There's these really tight bomb runs. You gotta grab these bombs and go running and just barely dip into the pipe to reset your timer and all kinds of shit. There's just shit. It's just shit everywhere. It's fucking bad. So don't do this to your players. But again, showing the versatility of the genre. Is that it can also be used to make legitimately difficult and punishing levels. I don't think it's well suited to that, because one of the fun parts of Metroidvania is being able to explore, but you can kind of push it further. You could do a Kaizo Metroidvania if you wanted to. You could do a full-fledged Kaizo level as a Metroidvania level, and I'd actually really like to see that. I really would. I got excited. Carl Sagan's troll level that he challenged Pooh with. If anybody saw that, I'm not gonna spoil any of it, but it's set up as kind of a troll Metroidvania with Kaizo elements, but it kind of takes a turn away from the genre, unfortunately. Still very cool. I'm hoping maybe somebody out there has done it. I'm hoping somebody much better than me does stuff like that. 'Cause it sounds like cool design space, but that's like a genre unto itself almost. But there you go. There's some good and bad examples of challenge design in these, because it's not just about the progression. The progression's the heart, but what you actually do with within that framework is really what's going to kind of shape the gameplay experience for the player, right? So you don't, in general, you don't want, just to reiterate for the umpteenth time, you don't want high enemy density. You don't want a lot of really difficult jumps. If you do have sections with tough enemies or lots of enemies or really precise jumps, they should be quarantined to sections that are one and done, to where you go through it and at the end something occurs that makes you never have to do it again. Some change happens in the level. It triggers an event, or it gives you a power-up. You probably don't even want to do the power-up or item route, because then if you lose it, you do have to do it again. So it should be probably something permanent that is changed. So the player doesn't have to keep repeating that shit. And other than that, everything should be nice and sparse. You know, just a dude here, a dude there. And they'll find ways to die. You do not have to... we can actually just go look at my clear rates. Just to illustrate... Granted, I have 3 profiles and none of them get a lot of traffic. But just to illustrate... my point. Like, Mechanical Forest, 0 clears. It's 0 clears, but like it... If you recall, looking at the challenges aren't too crazy. There's some precise platforming in places. Steelbite Caverns also got 1 clear. That one's also the platforming thing. Right, Tomb of the Frost Elemental, very, very sparse enemy placement, as you recall. Very, very few enemies, and all the platforming is like the tough platforming parts are one and done, and it's still at 1 clear. This one's been up for a while. This has been up. Does it have the upload time? Where does it even show that? I don't know where it shows that. I've been playing this game for a year, and I don't know where it shows that. But anyways, like it doesn't actually take very much at all. To push these levels into super expert. Players will find their own ways to die if you just let them walk in circles. So I wouldn't worry about that so much. And just moderation. Moderation is key. Be frugal with your Goombas, because they multiply more than you'd think. Alright, so we've got one more part, and I hope to see you there.